Oh. The mare's tail. Not to be confused with the mare's tail. This is not about some porky pie told by a PM in a former life. Indeed, perish the thought. Oh dear me, no. This concerns something far more serious. My personal nemesis. One of my 2 personal nemesi. Is that even a word? Oh, no matter. But more of that in due course. Here am I, sitting on the veranda of my allotment shed, surveying the plot and planning my chores for the day. Okay then. Avoiding putting actual hoe to actual soil and occasionally inspecting the backs of my eyelids. Well, the weather's far too nice for toiling anyway. And since lockdown started, it's been a haven of peace and tranquility here. Mind you, I have noticed the odd chainsaw, angle grinder and tree shredder beginning to impinge on the calm. I expect in a few months' time they'll be joined by their spectacularly pointless cousin, the leaf blower. Oh look. I see there's a pigeon methodically decimating my neighbour's broccoli. Get out of it! You see, this is why I never attempt to grow brassicas. What makes pigeons even more infuriating is that once they've finished scything everything in sight, they leave most of the debris scattered over the soil uneaten. And here I was thinking it's only us humans that go in for gratuitous, wasteful, wanton destruction. You know, the first few weeks of lockdown produced a special sort of silence here. A silence quite unlike any I can recall. In the olden days, remember them, before our lives got changed forever? Well, it was always possible to come down here first thing of a morning and enjoy the bird's song and the gentle rustling of the breeze in the trees. Sometimes there'd be a pheasant, and we had a resident pair of red-legged partridge. At other times, I'd hear a woodpecker busily drilling into one of the majestic beech trees at the top end of the site. For such a small creature, it made an inordinate racket. Thinking of it now puts me in mind of a certain political advisor who gets routinely portrayed by one of our popular cartoonists as the Mekon from Dan Dare. Mind you, given that he felt the need to drive 30 miles to check his eyesight, I wouldn't put money on him hitting his target. But all these natural sounds were accompanied by those of everyday life. The distant rumble and clickety-clack of a goods train. The reversing beep, beep, beep of the waste and recycling collections. The banter of tradesmen. The excited screams of children. And the din of approaching planes. Our allotment lies right next to the glide path into Manchester Airport. So aircraft noise is something we've learned to live with. Or at least tune out from. But the early days of lockdown were very different. On my first few visits here, on my bike I might add, I was struck by how strange it sounded. Or rather didn't. Of course it wasn't actually silent. The birds were relishing their newfound freedom. And in such variety too. I hadn't really appreciated that before. At one point, I became aware of what I assumed to be the faraway roar of an aircraft. Strange, I thought. How can that be? At that time, the only flying things the world over were of the animal rather than the mineral kind. After a bit, it dawned on me. It was nothing more than the wind sighing in those beech trees. Now, at nigh on 72 years of age, I'm well acquainted with the range of noises wind can produce, in every sense. But it had never sounded like this. And the atmosphere felt not quite right. There was almost an air of foreboding about it. And then, piercing this unearthly stillness, the urgent wailing of emergency vehicles, a sound that became increasingly dominant as the weeks wore on. Knowing what we now know, of course, all this was tragically prescient. But I digress. Back to the plot. See what I did there? I said this was going to be about my nemesis. To be precise, the pernicious weed known as mare's tail. You may not be familiar with it. Lucky you. It's sometimes called horsetail, but I prefer mare's tail because, as everyone knows, the female of the species is always deadlier than the male. It may be my arch enemy, but even I'd have to admit it is a rather remarkable plant in many ways. For one thing, it's truly primordial. Officially, i.e. according to Wikipedia, it's been around for more than 100 million years. That's even longer than Nigel Farage. My theory is it actually predates the Big Bang. I've got this image in my head of his divine godship sitting on his allotment veranda, pondering how best to eliminate this confounded weed. Suddenly, a metaphorical light bulb blinks into life above him. Bing! Eureka! He cries. Or words to that effect. I know what I'll do. I'll conjure up a humongous firework, the likes of which will never be seen again. And if that doesn't do for the unholy pestilence, I'll eat my hat. Now, I don't know whether you'll have noticed, but throughout human history, pictorial representations of the Almighty invariably present him bareheaded. Except perhaps for a halo, which in my view is sorely in need of polishing. I'm just saying. So, that's Marestail's first remarkable characteristic, longevity. It's not only the time scale that's mind-boggling with Marestail, it's also the vast extent of its root system. Newcomers to the allotment often make the mistake of assuming that if they dig over their entire plot down to a depth of 3 or 4 feet, they'll root it out, so to speak. Would that it were that simple. I can only imagine their pain and heartache after all that unhealthy exercise, when the dreaded menace comes right back within the same season. One of the allotment oracles once informed me that Marestail roots were routinely seen poking through the ceiling and walls of mine workings many hundreds of metres below ground. I can quite believe it. But that set me thinking. As the roots make their relentless journey downwards, does there come a point at which they're actually travelling upwards? And if so, which bit of the weed eventually breaks surface in New Zealand? South Africa has some strange trees called baobabs, that appear sort of upside down, with their tops resembling roots. Maybe that's what Marestail looks like in the southern hemisphere, roots above ground. But then, where would the green bits be? No, that doesn't seem very likely. There's got to be another possibility. For a while, when I was a student at Leeds University, one of our lecture blocks housed those continuous elevators known as paternosters. Maybe you've seen them. A sort of vertical conveyor belt comprising a succession of open-fronted cages. On each floor, the upward and downward cubicles were sited immediately next door to one another, and if you wanted to go up, you hopped into one on the left. Down, you stepped into one on the right. You had to have your wits about you, because they never stopped moving. Oh, notorious death traps they were. Anyway, students being, well, students, it was compulsory for the old hands to play practical jokes on the poor unwitting freshers. They'd enter an upward moving cage in the normal manner, but then, once out of sight, they'd do a handstand, and eventually reappear upside down on returning to the original floor. This was a tradition comparable to the ceremonial placing of a traffic cone on the head of every accessible statue on campus. And that practice used to make the pigeons mad as hell, I can tell you. Good thing too, if you ask me. So anyway, that's Marestail's unusual property number 2. Its infinite root system. No doubt you've been wondering what my true purpose is here. Well, I shall tell you. It's to observe Marestail growing in real time. A challenge prompted by the weed's third amazing talent. You see, contrary to popular belief, the shortest time interval known to mankind is not that between the traffic light changing to green and the impatient blasts from the car horn behind. Oh no, it is in fact the interval between clearing your plot of every last trace of Marestail, putting your hoe safely back in the shed, then turning to appreciate the fruits of your labour, only to see the latest pair of devil's horns poking up from the earth, mocking you in two-fingered delight. Come to think of it, that's uncannily like Nigel Farage too. The odd thing is, I've spent hours staring at the plot, but I've never once witnessed Marestail actually popping up. This is truly perplexing. I mean, how can it both grow like lightning and yet never be seen appearing? As a former physicist, I'm rather drawn to the wave-particle duality of light by way of analogy. You'd think it would be either one or the other, but somehow light manages to be both a wave and a particle, a photon, simultaneously. It must be the same with Marestail. It can both appear instantaneously, if not observed, and yet never if watched like a hawk. For some reason or other, the well-known, or perhaps not so well-known, uncertainty principle of Mr. Heisenberg comes to mind. He basically said that if you observe something, it changes. Possibly. I reckon I finally invented a cure for the allotment curse. Set up permanent video surveillance. That should ensure that it stays permanently out of sight. I wish. No, put simply, Marestail is pure evil, vegified. And if that isn't a word, well, it damn well ought to be. Oh well, I guess we're just stuck with it for the duration. Oh yes, my second nemesis. Well, let's just say that's a whole other diatribe, Mr. Schrödinger. Ooh, time to head back home. Reckon I've avoided actual work for long enough to appear respectable. Thanks for listening. I'll see you later.